Okay, so before we start to understand how and why a rift between WWF and Marvel Comics started, we need to go back to before wrestling became a national and international showcase. Before Vince McMahon started his great expansion across the United States, American wrestling was very much a territorial affair, so wrestlers' names and gimmicks didn't necessarily travel that far. If they became a big draw, then they might travel around as the NWA champion, for example, but for the most part it was very much a regional production. Now that all changed in the 80s when cable TV and videotapes became more popular, which raised certain wrestlers to national stardom, but it also killed the whole territorial concept because inconsistencies in storylines became all the more apparent. But the point is, during the territory days, promoters and wrestlers wouldn't be too worried about borrowing certain gimmicks from others' intellectual properties, because chances are it'd be considered fairly small potatoes and you wouldn't end up with a lawsuit on your hands. When you start becoming a global megastar, on the other hand, people start paying attention. Hulk Hogan, like many wrestlers, went through many a name change over his career. One of the first was Terry Boulder, a play on his real name of Terry Bollea, and would often tag with his kayfabe brother Ed Boulder, who we would know best as the future Brutus Beefcake, as the Boulder Brothers. During a promotional run, he appeared on a talk show with Lou Ferrigno, the actor best known for playing the Incredible Hulk on TV. But what was amazing for Terry, and not so good for Lou, was that Terry Boulder was even bigger than the guy who was meant to be the Hulk. As such, the majority of the locker room dubbed him the Real Hulk, and never one to miss an opportunity, promoters repackaged Terry Boulder as Terry the Hulk Boulder, or sometimes even just the Hulk. After a brief period with the name Golden Sterling, Vince McMahon Sr. was tipped off that this Hulk of a man may be a good draw in the New York territory. The name Hogan was supposedly added because McMahon wanted him to have an Irish name, which is presumably bankable in New York. Realistically, Hogan isn't actually that much of a popular surname in Ireland, but I suppose Hulk Murphy or Hulkabrian doesn't quite have the same ring to it. After a few tryouts against jobbers, and after he'd finished his tenure as Sterling Golden, Hulk Hogan moved to the WWF full-time, being managed by classy Freddie Blassie. In the early 80s, he started to morph into the Hulkster character. Arguably the first time we would see the iteration of Hulk Hogan as the majority of the world would know him was in 1983, and WWF pushed the boundaries of trademark infringement that much further by introducing him as the Incredible Hulk Hogan. And it also wasn't long until he was busting out of his shirt, just as the comic book character did. It obviously didn't take too long before Marvel Comics took notice and the negotiations began. But rather than repackaging Hogan under some other name, WWF actually came to an agreement to pay Marvel royalties for the use of the Hulk name. In a 1985 document signed by Terry Bollea himself as a representative of Titan Sports, Marvel was given rights to all variations of the name, including Hulk Hogan, Hulk, Hulkamania, and Hulkster. WWF was essentially given a blanket license to use the name, but only in reference to Terry Bollea, no one else. And in fact, there's a clause that says all merchandise, including the likeness of the character, has to look like Terry Bollea. Action figures to be created by companies like LJN actually required Marvel's approval before they could be made. The document was backdated to July 1984 and would be in effect for 20 years, but that actually means that come 2004, the agreement would no longer be valid and Titan Sports would have no rights to use the name at all. For the period of the contract, Marvel would receive royalties for every time Hulk Hogan made a wrestling appearance, $100 to be exact, and would also receive royalties for every piece of media or merchandise in which he was featured, not including press articles. But there were conditions to the use of the name. WWF were not allowed to use the term Incredible, and they would also have to actively discourage unaffiliated announcers from using it. They also couldn't just call him Hulk, he had to be referred to by the full name of Hulk Hogan, and Hogan always had to be equally or more prominent. So Marvel actually owned Hulk Hogan and could use the name and concept however they liked. They were only subject to a 1-year non-competence when using it in a wrestling capacity. They could have arguably done a separate deal with the Hulk name with someone else as well. In 1988, there was even a Marvel Comics release in which the Incredible Hulk battled Hulk Hogan for use of the name Hulk. But far from being some form of epic crossover, if anything it was designed to embarrass Hogan. It even implied that wrestling was fake, which in 1988 was still a big no-no. You see, while animated versions of Hulk Hogan were allowed under the license, comic book versions were not, but Marvel was still free to use the name as it was their character. And to further guarantee that there was no confusion between the two characters, Hulk Hogan could not be associated with the colours green or purple in any way whatsoever. While Hogan wrestled under all sorts of colours to that point in his career, usually favouring baby blue or white and sometimes yellow, WWF essentially went as far away from the colours of the Incredible Hulk as possible, quite literally. In fact, they grabbed a colour wheel, looked at the opposite colours, and boom, there you go, the iconic red and yellow of Hulkamania. But here's where it gets interesting, because in 1994, Hulk Hogan left the WWF and went to WCW, but he took his name with him. You see, technically speaking, the agreement was with Terry Bollea of Titan Sports, not Titan Sports itself. Eric Bischoff has even stated on his 83 Weeks podcast with Conrad Thompson that he didn't have to deal with Marvel at all, that was all down to Hogan and his lawyers. In 1996, Hulk Hogan turned heel and started using the name Hollywood Hogan whilst part of the NWO, a reference to him making increasingly more frequent appearances in Hollywood movies and the lifestyle that he was supposedly able to live thanks to Ted DiBiase being the money behind the faction. And in fact, some people even thought that the name NWO was a reference to Marvel Comics. In 1993, a year before Hogan joined WCW, Marvel released The Incredible Hulk number 403, which was the first appearance of the NWO, in which the Hulk is brainwashed into becoming evil. Whilst using the Hollywood Hogan name, Marvel were not entitled to royalties at all, as under Clause E of the agreement it states, Marvel will not be paid for any event, thing or act where Terry Bollea appears or is involved with under his name or any other name than Hulk Hogan. Seeing as Hogan was still involved in wrestling past the end of the 20-year agreement, in 2005 he purchased the rights to the Hulk Hogan name from Marvel directly. Thus Marvel's ownership of Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania came to an end. But, I mean, they did alright post-2005, and we didn't exactly need to see Hulk Hogan in the Avengers now, did we? But anyway, that'll do it for this video. Let me know down in the comments section whether you think this was the right move for both parties, and I will see you all in the next one.